Roy B. live and direct. I'm sorry I'm late to the party, but at least I made it. Today, we're going to be talking about slavery across the world and how it culminated in America and the effects that it has had on us as black people and me and my this wonderful woman I have here with me. um, she was born just after the Jim Crow era. She has a lot of experience dealing with life as a black American, and I thought it would be no greater person to talk with me about this subject than my beautiful mom. So, mom, go ahead and say hi to the people.
Hi, everybody. How everybody doing?
All right, it's my wonderful mom. All right, mom, this is how we're going to do it real quick. I'm going to go through these notes that I have about slavery first, and then we're gonna go and I'm gonna start to interview you, and you tell me your experiences. I'll ask you a few questions, and we'll go from there. So, yeah, let's start here. So,
Okay.
first, the first mention of slavery was in the Code of Hammurabi, circa 1860. They had no written languages, so it is like perceived that the Code of Hammurabi is what it was mentioned in, and it may be people having drawings on walls or cave paintings that they linked to the Code of Hammurabi to kind of get a consensus on that being the first mention of slavery. And again, this is 1860 BC, so before Christ. Before this is like just after the flood, essentially. Don't quote me on that. All right, but again, moving forward, the Arab slave trade was considered to be the first large scale slave trade in the 7th century, and they shipped people from West Africa to the Arabian Peninsula, and also people from the Arabian Peninsula who were exiled or cast out to internal slavery has gone back since the beginning of civilization. So slavery itself is just as old as humanity,
Yes.
and that's just a fact. So where we come to now is the Atlantic slave trade, which most people know about, and that started between it was going on between the 15th and the 19th century. So from the 1600s to the 1800s, it was very prominent, and they consider it the 19th century because 1865 is when the Civil War was ended, but slavery was still rumored to be continued after the Civil War, and it took decades for it to completely be abolished, and the Union had to. That's another episode I'll do about the Civil War. So I'm gonna keep going because I got a lot of stuff here. And the Atlantic slave trade would trade people from sub-Saharan Africa, which they took that idea from the Arab slave trade because it was so prominent. They were like, "Hey, let's jump in here," and that's where you get the triangle trade, slave trade, which people know from Africa to Europe
Mm-hmm.
to South America to America and the Caribbean. Now, what's going to shock people most is only 7% of all slaves made it to America, the US. 30% were shipped to the Caribbean and the Caribbean islands, and 60% was sent to Brazil and Portugal. Now, moving forward, I'm going to jump a few things.
Okay.
By the 1800s, a quarter of all black people in the US were a quarter of all black people in the world, excuse me, at that time were in the US. And also, they were third, fourth, and fifth generation Americans. They were removed from their heritage by the 1800s. So, from the 1600s, by the 1800s, most all of the American slaves, or most of them, were removed from their heritage, which you get the story of the Roots movie. There was, very, very few that actually knew, hey, my name's Kunta Kinte. I come from the Kinte tribe. But that was very, very rare. And that's because of the rampant disease. They were living in such terrible living conditions that disease killed most of the slaves. And in the Caribbean and South America, most of them by the 1800s were born in Africa. And when the slave trade first started, they were trying to, of course, chattel the slaves to, to create internal slavery, to have make the slaves have babies um, so they wouldn't lose slaves. Let's see.
Slaves were the money makers. So go
Oh
ahead.
yeah, yeah. By 1807, the slave trade was outlawed by the British Parliament and the United States Congress. But this is where America gains that one phrase that you hear, that's America's greatest sin, is slavery. Because by 1807, they knew that these black people in America, a quarter of all black people in the world, were concentrated in the US. Millions of them. Over a million died on the voyage. And by let's go from the when it was outlawed, because everyone needs to know this, because this is what's not known. That's why I'm late to the party. I'm bringing you stuff that you probably haven't known, just in case you were. But the U.S. continued internal slavery from 1807, even though it was outlawed. They continue it from 1807 until, guess when? 1865. And when was that, Mom? That was the end of the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
So it continued, even though it was outlawed by the Congress, they still continued to do internal slavery because they had the three-fifths law. If you were considered property. So that's how they kind of went around that. So just in case people didn't know. So let's go back a little bit. Um, Britain's triangle trade was the most profitable of all Atlantic trades. Plantations in the South in America, in the American South, were usually around less than 100 slaves. In the Caribbean and South America, it was way more than 100 slaves on the plantations, because that's where the sugar plantations were, and those were the most profitable of plantations and consumer products. In Britain,
Okay.
huh? What do you say?
Sugar cane.
Yes,
Continue.
yes. Yeah, sugarcane plantations. In Britain was a huge fan of sugar at that time, with tea and the Renaissance, what have you, what not. Most of the slaves in the Caribbean and South America died from disease. So that's why most by the 1800s, most of the Caribbean and South American slaves were born in Africa, because they were dying and their fertility rates were so low that they would just die off and they would have to get more slaves, to the point where it was millions of people being traded in the slave trade, and they outlawed it in 1807. So by then, most of the slaves had been, they were straight from Africa, living in the Caribbean and South America. And that's when you get the Haitian Revolution. They fight the French who try to colonize, and they fight back, because these guys, they were straight from Africa. The American slaves in the southern U.S., they didn't have much of an inkling of where they were from, besides growing up in that terrible condition of slavery, which continued for generations. And the slaves, when they first came to America, they were sent to the ports. And let's see here, over 820,000 slaves died at port. That's been documented because of the 2-month voyage from Africa throughout the triangle slave trade. Because if you think about it, Europe is here, Africa is here. Europe and South America are closer to Africa than the US. So if you made it to the US, which only 7% of the slaves who were traded did, you were lucky. And even then, 820,000 of the tens of millions of them perished at the port. Um, Many of the slaves jumped overboard, which we all know due to conditions. But you may not know is even the sailors died and would be reluctant to do the voyage because of the conditions and the disease, and many of them would die and they hated the job. But the captains continuously did it because even if they lost a sailor, guess what? Less people they gotta pay. Isn't that interesting? So, after they were brought to port, most of the slaves were sent, even if they were shipped towards the Americas, they were shipped into what's called seasoning camps. And that's where 84% of them were used for the sugar plantations. And that's where you get the buck breaking and the mandingo fighting. All of that had started to culminate then.
Okay.
But yes, let's see here. Yeah, so jumping forward, the U.S. continued the slave trade, as I said, from the 1800s, even though it was outlawed, until 1865 in the Civil War. Now that after the Civil War, what we do know is that the Jim Crow laws were enacted, separate but equal. And a little fact I want to shoot at everybody is that Abraham Lincoln was quoted saying that if he could stop this Civil War without freeing the slaves, he would. So just keep that in mind when everyone's praising Abraham Lincoln for freeing the slaves. Also, in
I'm gonna jump in here real quick.
yeah, sure.
First, we're not going to target anybody, but what we will do is give, do what's due. And with that said, even though he's
Well, I'm not taking anything from him.
I know. All I'm saying is that at the end of the day, our heart was changed. Okay, and so that out of everything, that was the best part about that whole era when it comes to him. So even though he had these, because he had a wife too that was speaking to him as well, which helped, with the change of the heart. And at the end of the day, that's what it's all going to take. But go ahead and continue.
Yes, Mary Todd Lincoln. She was considered to be a little bit fanatic, but she was very, very adamant in the mistreatment of black people in America. And so is Lincoln. I'm not saying that he was like the staunch racist, but then again, back in those times, it wasn't meant to be equal. We weren't seen as equal, and even though he didn't like that, he knew the reality of it, and he knew that that would be the first step to getting black people the freedom that they deserved. Now, moving forward, Jim Crow laws prevented blacks from owning homes, jobs, and getting an education, which led to, HBCUs and what have you. But a little fact, Alabama was the last state to overturn its ban on interracial marriage in November 2000. Just a little fact for you. And every known government has banned slavery. To this day, every known government has banned slavery. Yet, there are more people living in slavery or bondage than ever before. And it's estimated to be over 50 million, with most of them being concentrated in Southern Asia, Africa, Western Europe, and that's over 50 million people to this day. So keep that in mind. Now, here, Mom, here comes to the part where I want to ask you, what was it like living in Alabama during those times, during the late '60s and
Well, as a child, growing up in the South back then, let me say this first. The community and the state in which I lived was segregated within itself. So that meant that there were, an area where there were mostly black people anyway back then. So back then in those times, my grandmother, which we called her Big Mama, she was one of the black women, of course, that came from those slavery times. She was born in the 1800s, late 1800s.
Oh wow!
But Big Mama, she was one of the black women that refused to comply with the abuse and the the
Mistreatment.
superiority of the white community in her life. So she had her own, basically. She had her own land. She had her own home.
Yeah.
She owned her own. She tilted her own fields and things of that nature. So growing up as a kid, we were kind of like surrounded with each other. But on the outskirts, when you went into town, that's when you would run into the racism. Well, what do I mean? Well, in the town that I lived in, it was a lot of African American black people.
And
This
what was the name of that town? I'm sorry to interrupt you.
I was raised in Clio, Alabama,
Clio, Alabama. Wow.
and and I was born in Birmingham, Alabama.
All right. Oh, I thought you were born. Oh, I learned something today.
And so, with that said,
Yeah.
when we, as far as my encounter, with racism, it was a couple of times. Number one, there was a school that was right down the road from us, and it was George Wallace School. And as a child, we knew what had happened there with George Wallace, and in turn, his heart was changed too because he apologized, but yet the situation was still what it was, which means, the schools and everything was segregated. So our schools were segregated. There were
Hmm.
no white kids in our school, and I never will forget the first time that I encountered a white girl that was came to our school, and that's when they were trying to, get segregation under control. And I remember the white girl. She wasn't familiar with me as well, and so she admired my afro. Back then, of course, we wore afros. And she told me, she said, "Yeah, I want my hair like yours." So being a child, I didn't know no better. So I got the little scissors that you have in the little kitty class, and I cut her hair. Well, I'm a child. I didn't
Mom,
realize.
you cut this young white girl's hair?
Well, yes, because we were children. She said she wanted it like mine. So that's what we did. We was playing dress up.
Right, you guys were both
That's
kids,
another
right?
thing. When it comes to racism and things like that, that's taught. That's not nothing that we're born with. Let's be
Right.
clear
So
here
the
as
the young
well.
girl wasn't inherently racist. That's something you
No, she
noticed.
wasn't. No, she was not.
Okay.
So,
What
I didn't
happened
grow
after
up
that?
either. They raised me to just be, to be watchful, but they didn't raise me to be, like that either. So I cut her hair, and by her hair being straight, for whatever reason, as a kid, I'm like, why it won't come out like mine? So it ended up coming out like a bowl. I had cut it in like a bowl, and that's the first time that I encountered the effect of racism and
Hmm.
what was really going on. And I was a kid, so when that happened, school was out. I'm at home, and all of a sudden, Big Mama says, "Lord have mercy, girl, what you done?" And this white man was coming down the road, and he had on
Oh.
overalls, and he came up to the door because somebody had already told Big Mama, what had happened. And she says,
Hmm.
"Lord have mercy, child, what you done went and done, Lord, what I'm gonna do this girl right here, Lord, she just don't get us in trouble, Jesus." Now, as a child, I didn't understand why Big Mama was so distraught. You know what I'm saying? I'm like, I don't understand why that was such a big deal. So he came on down the road, and he knocked on the door, and he was like, "Miss Liz." He's like, "Come on out here, I want to talk to you." And she said, "All right, sir, I'm coming."
Oh man.
Right now to this day, that really got to me because it was though she was giving him a level of respect. But as a kid, I'm looking at him. He got on overalls just like my cousin over there. So why do he have to be sir?
Mm.
But I'm a child, I was staying in my place back then. That's the way that was. And so he proceeded to tell her, what I had done. And this is where I found out that there was a level of respect for the blacks that had their own back then. He said, "Well, Miss Liz, I know you're a good woman, and you take care of everything. I just wanted to let you know what your granddaughter had done. We got to be careful with that around here." And she's like, "I know, sir. I'm going to talk to that child. Lord have mercy. I'm sorry, sir."
Wow.
That's when I realized, even as a kid, I'm like, okay, all these sirs and her, and it wasn't necessarily the words,
It was
but
like
just
the
her
panic.
body language. Yes, but you could see, and even as a child, I could tell that she was worried. Something, she was just pacing the floor, and so that was my physical experience with, the effect of racism and the white man. Even though my big mama had her own, you know what I'm saying, she still had that effect.
Mm.
Going to fast forward, later on in life, they somewhere
So
in
I'm
life.
sorry to cut you off. So after Big Mama spoke to the white man, that was the end of it. You weren't pursued, or she wasn't like Nothing like that, but it
No, because they had a level of respect for her,
right.
a
Okay.
level of respect for her
That's
in that
amazing.
instance. But there was an instance that my uncle, her son,
Hmm.
Uncle Ed, we called him Uncle Edward, he got a little intoxicated and decided he wanted to go and talk to a white woman. And
Oh,
that particular day was bad.
what
Big Mama
happened?
had to call everybody down there in Baptist Bottom, to try to go get him. And I never will forget these words. She said, Lord have mercy, somebody go get Edward before they kill him.
Mm. Because he was drunk
Yeah.
trying to talk to a white woman,
Yes,
and
yes.
word had got
Before
back
they
to her.
kill him. Yeah. Huh?
You said, and word had gotten back to Big Mama, like you sent somebody to come and get him.
Yes,
Oh wow.
yeah. Somebody went and told Big Mama, say, Edward down there, in that shack down there, drinking with this white woman, and she hollered. She said, "Wow! Somebody go get him." She got to, banging up
It's not
everybody to
funny,
go
but
uptown to go get him before he get caught. And I would never will forget the words she said, "Go get him because they gonna kill him."
yeah,
Because that's the
that's
way it
terrible.
was.
Hmm.
We weren't able to drink out of certain water fountains either. So,
And that really brings home the point of it it wasn't until November 2000 when Alabama overturned its ban on interracial marriage.
yes,
So,
exactly. And let's be clear when it comes to, going back from slavery, because, when it comes to slavery, we did prosper in a sense in that manner, but yet we kind of didn't because there's a story where my mother, because slavery was abolished, okay, but my mother, and I was young then, I can remember her, she took care of our Caucasian brothers and sisters' family. What do I mean by that? She would take care of the kids while they work and cook
oh
for dinner,
wow,
and things of that nature. So that was still, I won't call it a level of slavery, but
bondage.
because of the situation they had put black people in, that's the job she had to take.
Wow. Hmm. And she
But
and
my
was
mother didn't play with that, so she took the job because she had to feed her child, which was me, and take care of her home. But what she did not do was comply nor tolerate disrespect from them. She didn't do that.
right. Oh my goodness. And wow.
So
So
then
back in the slavery times, they would call that a mammy who would basically rear the children, uh, while the wife or the mistress would, do whatever, and they would okay, so she would cook for them
that
and
was the term that they used back when I was I was about 4 or 5 years old. As a matter of fact, that's what they would call the black women. But over time, I want to
mm,
say I was about 7 or 8 years old. The word "mammy" became like a cuss word to us as black kids back then. So
wow.
if you wanted to hurt somebody's feeling in an argument, because back then we wasn't shooting up each other and things of that nature. We just, what y'all saying these young days, throw them hands.
Yeah, yeah.
As kids back then, but that was one of the terms because, and see, that's where I say, the conditioning of slavery was terrible, because, now we took the word mammy and it became an insult to us. So when we wanted to hurt your feelings, we say your mammy.
Oh no way! That's where that comes from.
Yeah.
Oh snaps! I didn't even know that.
And then after a
Breaking
while,
news.
our ancestors, our grandmothers and our grandfathers, they didn't want us to be like that either. So, they would, you better not
Mm,
say mammy no more. So we started
mm.
saying your mama.
Wow.
We didn't want to hurt your feelings or you and
Wow.
be like your mama. So yeah,
Wow.
but yeah, so mammy, that was the word that was used. Actually before my time and during my time, I can remember being a kid, and they would show cartoons on Saturdays, and back then it was in black and white,
Mm-hmm.
and I used to wonder why they had these monkey-looking, big-lip people on TV. And as a child, I don't know what was wrong with my brain even back then, but I would look at that, and to me, I didn't understand what they was trying to predict on on that cartoon because it didn't even look human to me. But so I would ask my mother. I was always inquisitive. So I asked my mom. I said, "Mama, why they got big lips like that and big ears?" And she explained to me it's called blackface. She said they're making fun of your race.
Mm.
Point blank.
Man.
So yeah.
And even still to this day, we're dealing with it. People are making it a political circus about it. They're trying to make it political when it was a form of demoralizing, and that's where I have my problem with right wing politics because or right wing commentators because let's be honest, the right wing politicians aren't going to be doing blackface. It's those attention grabber Facebook people who do the videos kind of like I'm doing, but I'm not trying to represent a political party. I'm completely in the middle when it comes to that. But I just wanted to say that. But yeah, did you?
Can I say something on that?
Yeah, definitely.
My feeling towards when it comes to the bottom line, when it comes to racism, even how it's been formed and where it's going and where it is, at the end of the day, it's a heart thing, okay?
That's right.
It's a character thing, it's a moral thing. How do you see your fellow man? Do you
That's
see
right.
him equally, or how do you see him? And at the end of the day, it shouldn't even be political. At the end of the day, because at the end of the day, nobody owns nothing.
That's right.
Nobody. And so the day that they can realize that they bleed like me, they poop like me, they be like me. You see what I'm saying? The only difference between us is the culture in which we were raised and the environment in which we are raised and the color of our skin.
Right. Which has very little effect on.
It's not going to matter to our Father what color you was. Okay?
Right.
Because
Right.
that color was made, that color was put on you because of where you live, so you can be able to survive in the environment in which
right.
he planted you. So at the end of the day, yeah, that's how I feel about that with racism. I just, it's very sad to be to be honest, to try to keep people down because you want to be on top.
Yes. And my feelings about it is I recently had a situation where I was working at a grocery store or co-op, and one of the guys had come in, and he was we was chatting it up, having a good old conversation and everything. Had a great conversation talking about the history and here and there. He seemed a little unhinged, a little off to me. But he was an older guy, so I gave him a benefit of the doubt because he was kind of going along the conspiracy theory route in this conversation, and I was just trying to ring him out. And he was a member of that co-op, so it was even more difficult because then they kind of get a level of priority because they have an equity within the business. If you're a member of a co-op, you know what I'm talking about. So in a nutshell, what happened is he was we were talking, and he had said, he was like, yeah, I've been a member for over 25 years. And I was like, wow, that must mean you are OG. He was like, what does that mean? I was like, it means like original gangster, like offering game, basically a person who's been around, who's wise, who knows, He was like, and then he leans into me and he says, well, they call me a dirty old white Nigger. And I said,
people know how to spell, right?
yeah. I just can't say it. I don't want to get flagged. YouTube gonna flag. I cut down on the cussing, Mom. For you too, Mom. No problem. But that's what he said, and I was like, and I kind of froze for a minute. And he was already done with his transaction. People were lining up. It was kind of starting to get busy because he was holding up the line, but that was the last thing that we had exchanged, and he kind of left. And I went to my coworker, and I was like, "Did you just hear that?" I kind of, at first, I thought I was hallucinating. I'm like, he didn't just say that. But then all of the Black history that I've learned, all the stories my mom has told me, some of them new today, but all of that came forward, and I'm like, no, I know what he said. I was just in shock. And I was like, I think that man just said the N word. And the girl, my coworker, she was like, "Really? That doesn't surprise me because he's been causing trouble around here, cussing out some of the workers and staff, and putting his mouth on the peanut butter receptacle because you could grind and pour your own peanut butter, but he would lick it off of the thing, which is gross, and he would be contaminating all this stuff." And they said no, but he was a member already. So they was like they've been dealing with problems with him forever. It became a whole firestorm. It was featured in the ground cover news. And what ended up happening is the co-op ended up banning him for life from that incident. Also, hold on, Mom. Let me finish the story. But also, no, you could come back if you want. If you gotta, get some water. And it was in the ground cover news, and he had wrote up like a dissertation talking about how he was treated wrong, and police came to his door. No, they just couldn't get in contact to him, so they found his address to serve him the trespass papers. Because that incident with him saying the hard N word to me wasn't the first instance of him harassing people, just having terrible conduct and being disorderly. So that's why they were justified in giving him that trespass and banning him. But where my problem came in is during the monthly meetings at the co-op, people would come in to defend him. And they would say that I was lying. I was there. They would hold on 1 second. Let me take you off the thing. They would say he's lying. They would say all types of different things. And basically trying to defend him, saying he's been a member, he shouldn't be, exonerated for this for life. It doesn't make sense, this and that. And that really showed me. That was my first real, in-depth experience. I have plenty more stories, but I'm running out of time here. But at the core of everything, I really want people to know that racism in America and classism kind of were hand in hand. It's a lot of different facts. You can look them up yourselves about slavery. I encourage you to do so, especially if you're an African American, because you need to know where you come from to know where you're going. And people need to know these facts about the Code of Hammurabi, the Triangle Trade, the Atlantic slave trade, the Arab slave trade, how South America and the Caribbean were one of the worst places to be during the times of slavery until it was outlawed. And even then, they were so isolated and the governments were so unstable that those black people fell into a sense of exile, and the Civil War. It's a bunch of things that go into it. So when people tell you to forget and forgive and to move on, no, we still have much to learn. There are still racists in this country, and there is still slavery in this world.
The widow's call. Isaiah 1 and 17, he has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with God.
All right.
In Galatians, it says, it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by yoke of slavery.
Don't be burdened again by yoke of slavery. What's the name of that Bible book and verse?
Some of it comes from, it's all over the Bible. So this one, you can get this from Isaiah 1 and 17. You can go to Micah 6 and 8. You can go to Galatians, the last one that I just read, 5 and 1.
Okay. Did you have anything else you wanted to add before we end the pod? Did you have anything else you wanted to add to this before I end to start editing? Just that. Okay. Well, I appreciate you again joining me for this interview. I'm gonna put this in, and I'm gonna edit certain things so it can kind of be cohesive.
Yeah,
You know,
we're not
but
recording right now, right?
yeah, I am.